Welcome back. Let's get into masks and solid shapes. So let's create something from scratch and animate it. I want to create a Looney Tunes style kind of end screen where, Porky Pig says, "That's all, folks," because this llama photobombed this image I took when I went on this trip, and it just reminded me of Porky Pig in the end of Looney Tunes. So let's create that on our own. I'm going to right click either here or in this area. Again, I kind of like to do it here because it's less likely the more layers I get that I'm going to run out of room to right click. So I just have gotten in the habit of doing it in the viewer. And I'm going to go down to solid. So this is how you create all the different kinds of things you can create in After Effects. So we'll go through all of this stuff in more advanced later lessons, but I just want to give you a taste of what you can create on your own without having to bring in other images, and how to animate masks and create paths. These are important aspects to a fundamental learning of After Effects. So I'm going to create a solid by clicking it. And again, all of these things I can change later as well, but I like the red solid here. You can grab the same values if you want to, and just hit OK. So now we have this big red screen. What's going on with that? It's because it's the top layer. If we wanted it to be below the stamp, we could drag it down here. We could reorganize our layers. But what we want to do is start with the solid color of the base of the image that we want to create. So let's go up to these tools we haven't really talked about much yet. And we'll go through these in more detail. But the two main ones you're going to use for creating your own assets from solids is the pen tool and this kind of shape tool here. And if you click and hold it, you can get different shapes. We're going to use the circle tool, the ellipse tool, but let me also just really touch quickly on the pen tool. If you hit G, you can pull that up as well. That's the shortcut. You can click, either a single click will make a point, or you can click and drag so you get handles. You can change these after the fact as well. So I want to make, nothing's really happening yet because I haven't closed it on the solid, but it's creating a mask. So it's creating this different shape. And I can hit Control and click out here to end it. I could also hit Escape, and I can subtract points. I can also go to the selection tool by hitting V and select one of these to bring up the handles. I can also add points by going back to G and selecting anywhere on this path, and it will create handles that are in line with the path that exists. Now, if I hit Alt and select one time, it will make the tangent handles go away. If I hold it and click and drag, I can make new ones. All right. So those are some of the basic functions of this. I could also hit V to go back to the selection tool, or you can also get to it up there. And you can double click on this to get transform handles and transform it however you like. You can hold down Shift to do a uniform scale. You can also rotate it. You can see how the cursor changes. If I hover the mouse over the edge, it can rotate this object. So that can be helpful, and we'll do it by this pivot point. So let's say I have this kind of odd object here, and I don't know if that's centered correctly. There's a couple different ways you can do this. You could hit Control, Alt, and Home, and it will move the pivot point to the center of the object. So let's say, let me move all this stuff over to the right. So I'm just clicking, dragging these points with the selection tool. Now, if I select the layer, we can see the pivot is there. That's not really the center. If I want to center it, I can hit Control, Alt, and Home. Now we'll try to center based on the kind of bounding box of this object. Now, to do this manually, I can hit Y to select the anchor point tool. That's also this little button right here. It's also called the pan behind tool, which I don't use because use it as an anchor point tool. If you hold down Control, it can snap to the corners or of the bounds of this. But just to make sure it's in the center, you could also Control double click this. It'll snap it to the center of that. So Control Alt Home or Control double click the tool itself will center it. All right. So where does this shape live? How do I see this? What's going on here? Can I animate it? Yes, you can. I'm going to hit V just to get back to the selection tool. I'll select the layer. I'm going to hit M for mask. So I'll bring up the masks. Now you can see we have a stopwatch next to mask path. If I click that, it's going to make a keyframe. If I go forward and start moving these around, either individually so I deselect the mask, then I can select individual points. So if I have the whole thing selected, either through double clicking, I can hit enter to finish that transformation, or I can select somewhere else to deselect it, reselect the layer, and now I can select individual points instead of the whole thing. So there's a little deselection, reselection going on to be able to go from selecting the whole thing to selecting individual points. So now I've moved this all around. You can see as soon as I do that, it's going to set a keyframe. So now it's kind of morphing between these shapes. So this is how you can affect solid layers, create your own animations from solid shapes, and create keyframes. So on solid layers. So that's just a quick overview of that. Select the layer, the mask layer that is underneath this, and just hit delete. And what we want to do for this effect is create the kind of Porky Pig, like we're looking down a tunnel effect, if you've ever seen the end of Looney Tunes. So I'm going to click the ellipse tool. I'm going to hold down shift to make sure it's a circle. Otherwise, it's going to be an oval. So I'm going to hold down shift, and then I'm going to hold down spacebar because it's not over the llama's face, and I want it to be over the llama's face exactly in the center. So I'm going to hold down spacebar while I'm still holding down shift, let go of spacebar, and then keep dragging. So you can kind of rearrange this as you need it. Now, once I have it in a decent spot, I can't really see it, so I'm going to have to let go and live with that. So it's the inverse of what I want. So now if we go back here, and we already have the mask open. If we don't, again, we can hit M. If you double click it, it'll bring up all the attributes. If you double click M on your keyboard, it'll bring up all the attributes for masks. Now we have this little drop down menu. We can choose subtract instead of add. I'm going to subtract that shape from the solid color. And that looks like it's pretty much in the center, but just to double check, I can move this kind of around. Now the trick to the one I already showed you is if we try to center this now, it's going to center based on the filled area. So I'm going to hold down Control and double click this, and it's centering the anchor point based on the fill. So I want to make sure to center it with the add on. So now watch the anchor point jump to the center of our mask. All right. So that's one little trick to keep in mind. So now we can go back to subtract, and now if we go to S for scale, it will scale from that circle. All right. So we have our first circle, and we want to create a bunch of these. But first, let me introduce you to some layer styles that's going to help create kind of this three-dimensional effect for each layer. If I right click on this layer, I can go to layer styles and go down to inner glow. Now, inner glow, it doesn't show up very well, but you can kind of see this very subtle glow here. So I want to make that a little greater. Let me hit Shift question mark to get that to fit. And now, since we added layer styles, there's all these options down here. Let's go to the inner glow. And now we have all these options, and you can see you can rearrange this to bring it up. So we can change the size of it. So let's increase the size. I'm going to hold down Control as I drag. So now we have this kind of nice glow effect happening on the inside edge. Now, when I duplicate this by hitting Control D, I'm going to scale this up, say by 120. We want a shadow to occur between these layers. So I'm going to add another layer style to this by right-clicking, going to Layer Styles, go to Drop Shadow. All right. Now let's affect this new effect we've got. And let me also just show you a quick little tip. It's hard to see all this because our mask outline is going on top of all this. So just to stop that visualization, we can toggle it right here. So now you can see that line turning on and off for the circle of the mask. So let's change the drop shadow for this so it's a lot bigger. Let's increase the size. And let's increase the distance. And let's increase the spread. Actually drop the distance back down to 0 so that it's centered around our circle instead of off to one side, which you could change with this angle here. If we increase the distance again, we can change the angle of the drop shadow, which I guess is an okay look to have it kind of directional, but I like it to be zeroed out. So now when we duplicate this layer, we have these layer styles are already applied. So I can just hit Control D, hit S. Now let's go 140. Now let's hit Control D, I can hit S, and hit 160. So I'm just going by 20 increments. Control D, S, 180. Now I think if we had reference up, I think each one scales a little bit greater than the last one. So let's just increase it by 5 each time. 145, 160, that would be now 170. Instead of 180, that would now be 195. So that it's not exactly the same each time. Let's do one more, duplicate, Control D, hit S. So it's going to be 30. So let's go to 225. Now, as we scale this up, I'm going to just shift select, and then I can collapse all of these layers down. As we scale these up, you can start to see some what's called rasterization here. These edges aren't very clear because we're scaling this image up. If you look at the first one, this is a very clean edge. If you look at the last one, it's not very clean. And that is because of rasterization, all right? We are increasing the size of the pixels as we scale this solid layer up. And there's a way to fix that, but let's make it even more of a dramatic problem first. I want to scale this up, so I only want to animate one thing. So let's parent all of these by shift clicking all of them, and then let's parent them to the first one. So now all we have to do is animate one layer. So I'm going to go in time. Let's turn all of these off just to see, or we can solo the bottom two instead of turning all the ones above it off, because I want to see where this finishes. We could also hit these two bottom ones and hit U to bring up the keyframes to see where they end. And I want to turn off motion blur because it's taking a long time to render and it's not improving it that much to take up that much more time. So somewhere in here, I want this effect to start to scale in. So I'm going to hit the stopwatch on scale here. I'm just going to click and drag this keyframe out somewhere. So that's going to be the end position. And then I'm going to increase the scale of this. And it's going to scale from the pivot of the llama head because we did that from the very beginning. We centered the pivot on the circle. So as we scale it up, you might be able to tell, you can see how pixelated this starts to get. And that is because it's getting rasterized. And the way to kind of have constant rasterization on is this button right here, this column of buttons. So I want to do that for all the layers. I want it to constantly rasterize. You can see it for vector layer, continuously rasterize is what it says. And so the difference between vectors and a rasterized image is the fact that if you take a vector image, or even let's say text, you increase the font, you don't see pixelated edges on text if you increase the font because it's a vector, all right? But if you increase like the scale of these pictures, that's a rasterized image. So you're going to start to see pixels of that image. Now, when we're creating these solids, that's just a solid color that we created. We should be able to control these paths and how clean those paths are that we created. So if we click this and turn on the constant rasterize, you can see now we have this super clean edge that we did before. Let me just toggle that on and off. You can see that change. So that's very important to know once you start to work with After Effects a lot more, the significance of that, because you're going to notice that problem more and more. I'm going to go back to this layer, hit U to bring up scale, hit K to jump to that first keyframe. I just want to finish scaling this up out of frame. So let's hit spacebar, and we have our Looney Tunes rings come in, and that's all, folks. Sorry, I laugh at stupid stuff. So I want this to slow in. So let's select this keyframe and hit F9. If you're on a Mac, that'll be probably Function and F9. You can also change the ease in and ease out, not just through the graph editor, but through the keyframe velocity. So let's take a look at that real quick as well. I want it to go even slower, but let's say I don't want to mess with the graph editor right now. I want to stay in this view. Click on this keyframe, go to keyframe velocity. So if you didn't want to press F9, the other way to do this is go to keyframe assistant and click easy ease. And you can see the hotkey right there is F9. But now that we've done it, I want to go to keyframe velocity, and I want to change this percentage. If it was a linear relationship, it would influence at 0%. So it just sets the influence that easy ease at 33. That's the default. But I like 66. So I'm gonna, even though there's no outgoing velocity because this is the end frame, I just change it out of habit anyways. So I hit OK, and now we have a much smoother and slower end animation to that keyframe, even though you can see the icon itself hasn't changed. The actual graph, if we looked at the graph editor, the plateau has gotten a lot greater. So see how that slows in a lot more. Look at the graph editor and we hit undo, we can see that change from, this is basically a 33% influence of this handle to 66. You can see it almost doubles. You can see it goes from this grid to that grid. So now in the graph editor, we could do this manually. I could click and drag this. I'm holding shift to make it sure it's in line here. I'm not going out of line some way. So I'm holding down shift and I can influence it even more. What you're trading off is it has to speed up somewhere else if it's going to slow down later. So it's actually going to go faster at the beginning unless I move the keyframe earlier in time. So that's going to be the trade-off using those handles. You can see it has to go faster to make up the time that you're slowing in later. So you may have to move keyframes around after you do something like this when you realize, hey, I don't want it to start that fast, but I do want it to, continue to go in slow. So that is masks, that is layer styles, that is animating, that's keyframe velocity, that's, a lot of different things to throw at you, but I want to give you enough tools before we jump into any very specific advanced projects that you can start to play with this stuff on your own and come back to the projects that we're going to do in these advanced lessons following this kind of an introductory couple of lessons here with this project. So thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson where we will dive into more specific and advanced topics individually. Thanks for watching.